here's an email that I got. Remember, we were talking about, and this maybe straighten up and fly right here, because this is history we've got to do correctly for the record. We were talking about the collaboration between Dick the Bruiser and Jerry Jarrett in 1982 when Bruiser, and I saw an ad. Bruiser had run Market Square Arena, I think, for the last time in 1981, and it Bruiser and it may have been Snyder versus the Kelly twins, Pat and Mike Kelly, in Market Square Arena in 1981. Can you imagine how abysmal that may have been?
I was afraid you were going to say Ox Baker was one of the opponents, and I was thinking, oh, that must have been abysmal.
No, but nevertheless, but and we've talked about just recently also when Bruiser and Snyder more or less strong-armed a piece of Louisville and Evansville, Indiana, from Jerry Jarrett when he opened back up in the early 70s, right? We had that discussion recently. And that was from a question from Dave Dynasty.
That's right.
And
a great historian.
Well, boy, you're throwing around the word. Hold on here 1 second. Wait a minute.
See, that's the key to getting your letters read on the air, ladies and gentlemen. You got to be you got to be a great historian out there. You got to know your area.
You're throwing that around like, Jimmy Hart saying baby. But anyway, it's fascinating because we've been talking a lot about various times where promoters have had wars. We talked about Sheik and the Bruiser. We covered the Atlanta wrestling war. But on a local level, there were still these little skirmishes going on in the territory days that until you look back and uncover, you don't really know the extent of or what happened. And when we've talked about Louisville history, remember I said Phil Golden's All-Star Wrestling that competed with Jarrett in Louisville and in other places in 1972 and 73. First of all, Phil Golden was either the brother or the cousin of Bill Golden, who was a member of the Welch family by marriage, and with Nick and Roy behind Jarrett in Louisville. In effect, you had members of the family running opposition to each other, which I always found fascinating. But Angelo Pafo was involved in that promotion, and he later on, 5 years later, with his sons, Randy and Lanny, would open up ICW in these same markets, try to do the same thing in the same place. And there's some additional information on Bruiser and or Jarrett and or Goulas in Evansville that Sean Delaney has done, because Sean Delaney has done the history of Evansville wrestling.
He's an adequate historian.
Well, Sean's thinking, why the fuck did you have to call him on that right before he mentioned my name?
Dave Dynasty gave me $50.
Well, Sean will beat that.
Oh, hey, Sean, give me a call.
He'll come up with at least $52.50.
All right.
But Sean, because Evansville, Indiana was its own territory with its own local promoter and own television in the late 50s, and then got swept up into using the Barnett talent in Indiana, and then that happened, and at the same time, the local promoter was out of business, and so Evansville had been dark, as they used to call it in those days, for most of the last half of the 60s, and we found out also the old Coliseum in Evansville was in... Oh, God, Sean's going to kill me because it's in his book and I read it, but the city owned it, and they had turned it for some reason into another type of facility where they were doing some kind of things with schools or whatever, right? So the only place to have wrestling was Roberts Stadium, which was an indoor arena, even though it sounds like an outdoor arena, but it seats like 10 or 12,000. It was just very big, right? So Evansville, Indiana, no live wrestling. Louisville, Kentucky, no live wrestling. Lexington, Kentucky, no live wrestling. A strip of Interstate 64 going from really southern Illinois all the way over through to into West Virginia. A lot of the towns were dark as a result of Bruiser taking over the Indiana portion of Barnett's territory and this was too far down for the Sheik. So a bunch of towns got lost in the shuffle. Did that set the stage properly, Brian?
It has set the stage, yes. Now open the curtain.
Yes, and overture curtain lights. So Evansville, the argument about was it still Bruiser and Snyder's town? Well, they ran Evansville for a few months in 1968. The Coliseum was unavailable, so they had to use Roberts Stadium. And Sean thinks they peaked with a show that drew around 2,500 people, which may be one of the bigger crowds in Evansville history, but fell to about 500 before they pulled the plug, including dropping the TV in November and December. And 500 people would have been an average and kind of on the poor end crowd in the 70s for Jarrett. But in the Coliseum, which you could get 2,000 people in with Vaseline, right? And it was a lot cheaper to rent. What a historic building. You can smell the mildew a mile away. But then Sean also says it was because Evansville came after Louisville. Around the time Jarrett had Louisville up and running, he got the TV deal with WTVW Channel 7, which is the station that would air Jarrett's show for most of the period of time he ran Evansville for all those years. And Sean thinks that's what got Bruiser and Snyder's attention and why they made their trip. I'm pretty sure that Louisville doing 5,000 people in some of those early days, weekly shows probably got their attention before he opened up Evansville. But I think Evansville, well, here's another town, right? This all used to be, it was probably an exacerbating factor. But with Sean's research, we always wondered, because even though Bruiser was getting a piece of Louisville for a number of years, a limited amount of his talent came and worked here, right? It was more Evansville that was using Bruiser and Snyder talent from Indianapolis than it was Louisville. Because remember I said Jarrett ran Roberts Stadium at first, because that was before that they had returned the Coliseum back to its original function and changed the city arrangements. And that was way too big a building for everybody. But there was a lot of Indianapolis talent filling out the early cards in Evansville. But only the bigger names like Bruiser and Snyder and, some of the other top guys would get booked in Louisville. And part of that was because on Tuesday nights at that point in time, the Goulas Welch territory, they probably had two other towns, but they weren't against a major town. But Wednesday nights by that point had become the weekly night in Nashville. And then whatever else they were doing on Wednesdays, they needed more guys in Evansville that could drive 100 miles from Indianapolis and make the show and get paid $50, because Evansville, it didn't ever take off like a Louisville or a Lexington. It was always the Wednesday night town. But there was I remember on one of the Louisville cards, and I wish I'd been going to live wrestling at that point, but it was like 1972 or whatever. One of the preliminary matches was Jackie Fargo versus Bobby Heenan. Can you imagine how much fun Bobby would have had? Bobby was smart to the business. Fargo, it was a match to put Fargo on the card because people loved him, and he was going to beat Bobby in 12 entertaining minutes, right? But because Fargo was so over, Bobby would have had a ball doing very little, if anything, and having, people going crazy. But anyway, so that shed some light on, at first, Jarrett really needed help with Evansville because it wasn't ever going to take off like Louisville was, really. And the building wasn't that big and blah, blah, blah. But that was a Wednesday night town to justify the spot shows that he could also run in northern Kentucky, like Owensboro, which is it 40 miles from Evansville? I used to make the trip, but it's not very far. It's in Kentucky, Evansville, right across the state line in Indiana. And that's where, again, the local wrestling war that I mentioned is just kind of interesting. And then I'll open the floor for your questions or organ playing or flute playing, whatever you want to do. But Sean thinks that part of Nick and Roy not pressing the issue over Evansville and Louisville with Bruiser, like, we're not going to give you a piece of our boy, opened those towns, is because Jarrett was already he was younger and he was way smarter, way more energetic at that point than Nick Goulas. And at that point, Roy still had a lot of confidence and faith in Jerry, but as Roy's dementia progressed, by 1973, they were suspecting, did he send Mario Galento in to fucking ambush Jerry on Memphis television, right? So these things were going on. So Phil Golden had been running Owensboro at the Sports Center down there.
How far is that from Evansville?
Like I said, about 40 miles away. But Phil Golden had tried to run Evansville right before, and Nick, using their guy in Bowling Green, started running the Sports Center in Owensboro on Monday nights off of the Evansville TV when Jerry was in Memphis and didn't really have any say about it. So Nick was already starting to encroach on Jarrett's TV 40 miles south of the market before he could even start running that town. And Phil Golden had already started trying to run Evansville with no television because Phil Golden was the promoter at that time in Paducah, Kentucky, all the way at the western end of the state, right near southern Illinois and, that part of in southern Indiana. So this is what I was going to tell Sean. Because he finishes up, he said it appears when Jerry cut off the deal with Bruiser and Snyder, they aligned with Phil Golden and sent guys to work the all-star wrestling events in Louisville. That's not true, because he didn't cut the deal off until after Phil Golden had already gone out of business. What happened was, as I mentioned him before, that's when Angelo Pafo went in with Phil Golden and wanted to open up this entire strip of dark towns. With Golden and Paducah and already having a television show there, All-Star Wrestling with Buzz Benson, and Angelo Pafo being from Illinois and always having wanted to run Southern Illinois, Southern Indiana, Louisville, and into West Virginia, that's the first time they tried it. Angelo was the top guy. He had worked for Bruiser for years and years, but wasn't at that time. I think he might have left there to do this. And he brought Paul Christie, who would be on a lot of the early Evansville events when Jarrett was running it. But Christie was until the late 70s when the competition went down, Christie had steady runs with Bruiser in Indiana, but had never been, he was a tag team champion with Moose Cholak. He was a mid-card babyface that the top heels that were going to fight Bruiser had to beat. But I think Angelo Pafo pitched him, come be a part of this thing with me, and you can be the world champion. And you can work with me as the miser or whatever. Then he was Angelo Pafo. And Christie was probably making as much money from them running 5 towns a week that didn't, particularly draw that good or that bad, and him being in the main event than him working 2 or 3 times for Bruiser in the third match. But anyway, that's You know that
And of course, Paul Christie made one legendary and weird appearance on TNT in the 80s as the wrestling magician, and then he was never
yes.
seen again.
Well, and the thing is, when they finally had to use him as a main event heel instead of a mid-card babyface golden boy Paul Christie, when the talent level went down, I think it was like 78 or 9 or whatever, he was fucking great. He cut these promos where you thought he was a fucking psychopath, but not like screaming over the top or whatever, but just I remember one of them when he started when he had first switched heel, he starts cutting the promo with his old golden boy sunglasses on, and then he makes some kind of point, but he takes the glasses off, and he could pop his eyes out wider if he tried than almost any human being I've ever seen. And he takes the sunglasses off, and his eyes look like ping pong balls while he's talking as calmly as possible. He was entertaining, and he could work, and he had a good body, but he wasn't going to, wasn't going to be a main event, especially at a dying territory and draw money at that point in time. He was already almost 50. He just looked so much younger. But nevertheless, they tried it with Angelo Pafo, had bought into the thing with Phil Golden, and then I think he just took it over at the end. Golden abandoned the baby. And then that's first place that he went to, and all the towns they tried to open up again when he had a promotion with Lanny and Randy when they joined with the guys from Knoxville. And it was, and think about that, the Phil Golden's promotion was All Star Wrestling from Paducah, and the guys in Knoxville had broken off and started All Star Wrestling that Angelo joined with International All Star Wrestling and then ICW. And they're all fighting over places like Evansville, Indiana, and Owensboro, Kentucky, even in their own companies and own families. I find it fascinating. Do you find it fascinating, Brian? Just fascinating?
It's always interesting, kind of the history of outlaw wrestling in that part of the country, specifically from like the late 60s up until WWF, which is the rise and fall of the Pafos, I guess, in a lot of ways. The rise and fall and rise of the Pafos.
But that's the thing, is that in those days, if you were smart to the wrestling business and had some knowledge of how to put shows together and put a structure of some network of towns together to keep some halfway decent wrestlers employed, you didn't need $1 million. You could get TV and run it for 10 or 12 weeks and start running live events, and halftime you could make some fucking money.
And how hard was it in some of those small towns? Well, I guess not the towns, but in some of those smaller cities to get TV back then.
Well, that's the thing. And, it was a blessing and a curse, because in Evansville, Indiana in 1970, they had, I'm going to say 3 television stations, and I might have to check and see if that third one had come on the air, but I believe it was 3. And so there's only 3 stations and however many hours in the day. However, at the same time, that's when they were still dependent on people watching for the commercials and et cetera, and their advertising income. There were no infomercials. So if they knew that a program would get an audience and you could sell them on that, then yes, they would fucking go with it. And there was a local history, and I believe it was with WTVW, of the local promotion years earlier, have being successful, whatever. They found a sympathetic program director, blah, blah, blah. So once you've got that, it was hard for wrestling to get kicked off because it always found an audience. And it was only, at various points in the 60s, the Chicago TV, Wrestling from Chicago, had been on in Evansville. Or, at one point, the Indianapolis TV, I believe they used that. But it didn't last. They weren't having success enough in the market to, at the live events, to justify running a lot of them. And if there's no live events, people kind of slacked off of the TV. It fed on itself. So if you could say, look, station manager, you know people like wrestling, they're going to watch it. Look at the ratings. We're doing 100 miles down the road in Louisville, and we're doing 5,000 people at the Louisville Garden, blah, blah, blah. Put us on, give us a chance. We're going to run every week at the Evansville Coliseum. We'll be a presence here. The world will be safe for democracy. And they were on Channel 7, I'm pretty sure, for years uninterrupted. Certainly, they were still there in 1980 fucking 2 and 3 when I left the territory. So
what about in 1991? Did you work Evansville with the Fabulous Ones?
No. Because there was no way that Jerry Jarrett was going to give us our guarantee to go to Evansville. And that was the thing, is we might as well have moved to the territory than if we had, because we had to fly in Friday night to be in Memphis TV Saturday morning. And then we'd do Nashville on Saturday night and then off on Sunday, but we'd stay because of Memphis on Monday and Louisville on Tuesday. And then Stan and I would go back to Charlotte on Wednesday. So, so I don't know what they were doing up there. As a matter of fact, you know what? Come to think of it, it was sometime in the, I'm going to say 89, 90, 91-ish time frame, I'm thinking that they may have quit running Evansville because it just got, and they were trying to concentrate more on Owensboro. Maybe I'm off on my time frame.
When you were working there in the early 80s specifically, do you remember ever hearing that kind of conversation? Why are we running Evansville? We should stop running Evansville? Or was it not at that point?
Well, no, because I'm going to say that there was a time or two when it fucking snowed or whatever that you could hear a mouse pissing on cotton in ringside. But when I say it was a shitty town, it was still selling in the worst time period for business. When I was going there between 1979 and 1983, they were still selling 2,000, maybe 2,500 tickets a month in that same fucking town, in a building that I'm pretty sure they were getting for $400, maybe. And the main event guys got a little bit more money, and everybody else got another $50 on their fucking check for a Wednesday night when nobody's doing anything else. And that's 1980 money is at 4 times. That's like everybody on the card's getting $200 to have a half-ass match on a Wednesday night. And I don't want to say half-ass because there was a lot of good matches in Evansville. Everybody didn't just tank it, but it wasn't like goddamn Mid-South Coliseum. But that's the thing, is they had TV there that they could also run Owensboro. They could also run Huntingburg, Indiana off that TV that drew 2,000 people at a high school gym. They were running 2 towns at least every week off that Evansville TV, and that was a small one in the overall scheme of things. So the TV is responsible for, on Wednesday and Thursday nights, them selling when Evansville was hot, and something like Lawler came back from his broken leg. They did $12,000 at $5 and $6 tickets. There were people standing in the fucking parking lot and in the fucking bathroom trying to, peek around the door. But normally they do 500 or 700 people, but it gave all the guys an extra payday, and it was only 2 hours from Nashville or whatever. So that's basically, everybody knew that's why you run fucking Evansville. You can't get in a lot of fucking small towns for spot shows on Wednesday nights in those days because many people went to church in that part of the country on Wednesday nights. So at least we could get the heathens to come to the Coliseum. And again, Christine Jarrett is selling her own tickets, and her driver, Donna or Sammy Malone or whatever, they're the 2 people selling the tickets. The ticket takers are volunteers that are, there because they love the fucking wrestling business. And, you're renting a building that seats however many people you need for a few $100s. And so it's not like there was a great expense to the fucking thing.